Okay, we're good to go.
All right, cool. Without further ado, then, I call upon the first speaker for the proposition to start this debate. Here, here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be starting my
Let us know your POI preference just before you start.
my POI preference is in the chat box, and I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Picture a world where a child enters life with no choice, only to face hardships because their parents made a decision without assurance of a stable future, right? This is not just unfortunate. We argue that this is like immoral, right? So proud to propose. But let me like just characterize the stakeholders within this debate for you. These aren't just like healthy, perfect children. These are also children that are born with, for example, disabilities. And so if all these actors are encompassed with like uncertainties, that is to say their parents not being in a position to guarantee whether they can in a likely scenario provide these children with a good life irrespective of their disabilities, gender, etc. Gender, etc. That is what we're essentially trying to argue, right? But what are our definitions then within this debate? Number one, what does this a good life essentially look like? And number two, to what extent are we arguing this uncertainty, right? Let me characterize to you first what is the framing of a good life, right? Understand that this is a safe living environment. That means that this isn't like a parent being homeless or unsure about their living conditions to a severe degree, right? This is about number two, financial security, which is being which is like having like money for baby products, education, food, etc., right? Basic things, a reasonable amount of savings like to account also for emergencies, right? But thirdly, like this also like has this also includes a strong sense of like sort of introspection about your emotional maturity, right? So that is to say that am I capable of fulfilling this child's needs? Do I have the things in mind I need to resolve or overcome, or any insecurities I can project onto them, right? Can I be patient with them? Like, am I having a child because I want a child truly, or because society has this general norm of procreating, right? But number five, this also looks like my relationship with my partner, right? This understand that this needs to be reasonably healthy, and this like my relationship with my partner has to be stable, right? With not a lot of fights, like and has like a common understanding, right? Do me and my partner agree on all of those fundamental rules of parenting? And if not, this can cause instabilities like divorce, etc., right, down to the line. And understand this also includes the fact that if I'm independent enough to allow my child to be like an autonomous being, right? Or will I overwhelm them or toxically control them, right? This is like essentially the basic understanding of what a good life essentially looks like in regards to a parent, right? So why is all of this important within this debate? We think that understand the world has become cutthroat and hugely privilege based, right? With so many individuals being left to live lives of suffering simply because capitalism has invested so much, and now only privileged people get the opportunity, right? It is important to like sort of consider of whether you have the capacity to help your child and nurture them like with resources to allow them a chance of a good competitive life, right? But understand that number two, global warming and mass climate change harm in the current status quo. Understand that people are dying because of this, for example, floods, earthquakes, smog, etc., right? So the world can break down possibly, right? You need to consider, am I bringing a child into an area that is reasonably healthy? I need to like really consider now if I will be able to protect my child from all of this, right? Now understand that thirdly, that too many parents like make bad choices, and this intuition and like time and effort of considering all of these things and then making choices makes them better parents, or if not better, then just reasonable, right? But number two, understand to what extent are we arguing this certainty on, right? We're arguing, and this is where like I would like to make a clarification so they don't gaslight this further on as being our burden, right? Understand that we're not arguing the inevitability of like an uncertain life right? Our stance is essentially that it is a moral duty of a like potential parent to have this layer of conscience before deciding to have a child. That is to say that they're in a position where they can guarantee that they will provide this child with the life that we have reasonably characterized for you within this debate, right? But within this debate, right? But understand the principal parameters within this debate. Understand that every individual has a right to life, right? And children, given that they are like unborn and cannot advocate for themselves, and they can't choose whether they want to be born or not, this means that number one, that choice is now loaned to parents, because now parents, being the ones responsible for this decision, need to fundamentally consider that the child is in a most likely situation in which a child would like sort of consent to being born, where they can like guarantee some good life, right? Otherwise you risk consciously like bringing a human like life into poor destitute circumstances, deliberately knowing that you cannot care for them, or that and that you and your partner cannot give them like emotionally like an emotionally stable home, right? Understand that while they might argue that bringing life into a world is inherently valuable, and like in unforeseen circumstances are inevitable, their claim that the right to procreate should be protected without restriction, even if parents cannot fully guarantee ideal conditions for a child's upbringing, doesn't principally stand, right? Because they need to prove to me how knowingly placing a child in like potential detrimental conditions, which can like in a likely scenario lead to long-term suffering and social issues, isn't a principled attack on the vulnerable stakeholders within this debate, which are these future generations, right? But what is the second tier within our argument? Understand that we all have a duty to avoid causing unnecessary suffering to others, especially the most vulnerable actors within this debate, right? Understand that these harms are not abstract and unable to be recognized. Most often, like before you become a parent, they're like very like likely problems that are very like sort of visibly going to taint your future child's life, right? But you deliberately ignore them and go through with them, committing a moral harm, right? For example, severe poverty, broken families, emotionally immature like families are all like visible problems that you and your partner and people around you can spot. So this means you are definitely aware of all these problems and their future impact, right? So this means that you can like that you this means that you consciously ignore these obvious indicators and like commit a selfish act, like one that you think may bring happiness, or may like sort of bring the precedent of what society expects you to do, right? What does this then lead to? This leads to like what does this like our characterization and argument leads to? This leads to more safer parenting and healthier kids, right? So understand that lots of people today are short-termists and make the choices without considering the obvious harms to their children, right? We are guaranteeing that that's not the case on our side of the house. Understand that they do this because in the absence of their child being proximately like present to them, they tilt towards making selfish choices, right? That maybe this child can heal me and my wife's emotional conflict, right? I couldn't be a doctor, I'll have a son and force them to become a doctor in my dream, right? So understand that these are fundamentally short-termist thought processes that do not paint out favorably for these children, right? Well, so understand what is the way up then. Understand that on our side of the house we emphasize that this is a moral duty of a parent to minimize foreseeable suffering, right? Suffering, right? Their choice to adopt from existing children needs to be fulfilled without creating like newer risks, right? But on their side of the house, understand that all the arguments they will bring may sort of hinge on the potential outcomes, which are speculative and not guaranteed, right? So claiming that children might thrive to ignore the inherent risks of being a child into like adverse conditions, it fails to address that should be created, that many children already live without the guarantee of a good life, and for all those reasons, so proud to propose.
सुहानी सर आने वाले हैं, आप उधर आ जाओ.
Thank you very much for that speech. We now call upon the first speaker for the opposition to start the debate from their end. Here.
Can I just get 30 seconds?
Yeah, that's fine.
Can you see me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Please give your POI preference before starting.
Starting my speech. in
POI
three-
preference.
Yeah, in the chat, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. An infant didn't have control over whether he would have cystic fibrosis. My dad didn't have control over whether the stock market would crash or not. We think at that point in time, I don't think side proposition understands what the world looks like. You don't have control over a lot of things in life. Life is very unpredictable. Life is very uncertain. Insofar as they don't get this very basic thing, I don't think they can take this debate. I have two argumentations for you at side proposition. First, how it's a moral right for you to birth children, irrespective of the certainty of providing good life. Secondly, how it's immoral to deem this immoral because it is just alienating to the vast majority of the world, i.e., how it openly supports historical colonial imperialism and capitalism. Before I get into my argumentation, some key pieces of rebuttals. First, on the actors, and they tell you this at first, and I don't think this was a very strategic thing to do. They told you about how on their side they're not going to allow people with disabilities to birth a child. I have just one question. How do you have control over the disabilities or mental illnesses that you get? People who are neurodivergent don't have control over that. Kids who have cystic fibrosis don't have control over that. I think at that point in time, you're blaming them for something that they don't have control over. Secondly, their idea about privileged people and how they have control over capitalism, etc., etc. We think at that point in time, the context that you outlined for us, that there's a hyper individualism and people are going out and there's a rat race outside. And I think this is beneficial for us because how can poor people then have control over their situation at the first place? Did they create capitalism? Did they create capitalism? Were they direct beneficiaries of it? No, I don't think they were. I think they're victims of the system and you're blaming them unnecessarily for it. Secondly, on the right to life. And simple rebuttal. You don't even have right to life on your side. On our side, you give them some sort of life. Life still exists on our side. Third rebuttal, about how the idea about unnecessary harms, right? And here's where I bring my rebuttal again. You should only be held morally culpable for something that you had control over, that you had the capacity to do. Insofar as people who are below the poverty line and have control over it, I don't think they should be blamed for it. But fourthly, and this is a strategic call out I have to make at first, the idea about how certainty should be limited before birth. We think at that point in time, all of the impacts about how this actor is going to have a good life simply goes away. First argument then about the moral right to birth children. But before I get into my argumentation, I'll take a POI if there's any. 1, 2, 3.
Do you think
POI.
that
I'll
it is
take
still
you later.
justified?
Moral right to birth children, irrespective of the certainty of providing a good life. A couple of premises I want to tackle here. First, on the right to bodily autonomy. And this is very, very important because people have a right to reproduction right because it's literally your body. We think at that point in time, if insofar as it's your body, we think you should have control over what you do with your body, right, etc., etc. But also we think it's important because parent is generally a moral actor and generally has more individual autonomy than the child because the child is literally not alive, right? But secondly, we think rights are independent of any practical outcome, right? We don't think the right to bodily autonomy we think the right to bodily autonomy still exists even if you can't provide a good life. But why is this important? This is important because one, I think your agency literally stems from the right to bodily autonomy, i.e. what you do with your body, i.e. the things that i.e. the freedom that you have to do with. it. But secondly, we think agency is directly linked to dignity, etc. But thirdly, and more importantly, we think as a woman, historically, you didn't have agency at all. We think this looks like you not being able to have money or generally resources. We think at that point in time, the only autonomy that you had in your life was your body. We think this has led to a rise in emancipation movements. But also, women generally feel liberated insofar as they have something that they have control over. We think in this status quo, women generally have control over their body. People can't dictate what they should do with their body at that point. But secondly, about human biology, and this is very important because reproduction is is a very integral part of your humanity, right? And this is where this might seem funny, but literally Mrs. Grind that is taught to us in primary school, right? This is important because reproduction is a core part of our life and a core part of our humanity. That's literally how progeny and things like that happen, right? But also it's a natural imperative to produce. We think at that point in time, people who can't reproduce don't think they have a fulfilled life. Second argument then. Before I go into my argument, I'll take you, Zainab.
Just because these outcomes aren't fully guaranteed, do you think that it still justifies taking all of those unnecessary risks because they're
We don't think you have
associated with another person's
we,
well-being?
we don't think you have control over those outcomes in the first place. Second argument, then, about how this is immoral to deem this as immoral because it is alienated from the vast majority of the world, i.e., how it openly supports historical colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. A couple of premises I want to tackle here. First, what kind of communities are we talking about? One, we're talking about specifically underprivileged communities, right? Who most of the communities are generally working class, etc. We think these are people who don't have a lot of resources, right? They cannot provide food, shelter, and security to their families. But secondly, we think we're also talking about minorities, ethnic religious communities, right? We think these are individuals or groups that have been victims of historical oppression. We think this historical oppression manifests in the way of systemic discrimination faced by them. We think this discrimination can be in the form of active neglect by the state. What does this active neglect look like? We think this looks like persecution faced by minorities, i.e., Parachinar genocide against the Shias. Secondly, we think this also looks like a lack of infrastructure, i.e., the failure to build or maintain essential infrastructures. But secondly, we think this also looks like poor public services like healthcare, education, law enforcement, social services, etc., etc. We think this also looks like economic mismanagement by the state. But thirdly, we are also talking about people with biological deficiencies, i.e., we're talking about infants who have cystic fibrosis, people who have hereditary diseases that they literally have no control over. But secondly, they're systemically targeted by this narrative. Why is this so? We think the context of this is artificial selection, eugenics, monarchy, and majoritarian communities. Why is this important? This is important because usually these majoritarian committees are incredibly powerful. This is problematic. This because they are able to systemically lock out these communities from acquiring a good life in the first place, right? We tell you at that point in time, the race is rigged, and these individuals and these monarchs are at the forefront of it, right? We think at that point in time, these individuals can now eradicate these communities and now have an incentive to do so because it's generally easier. We think this looks like how white people can literally use this belief to make sure that black communities don't come into existence ever. But fourthly, we think not only does this mean that you are immoral, but this also means that you cannot be immoral as your lack of capacity to provide a good life doesn't exist, right? We think at that point in time, your lack of capacity to provide a good life wasn't your fault. We think this means that most of the harms that pernicious aristocrats or powerful people do that inflict upon you, we think this literally means that you are prevented from ever being provided a good life. We think insofar as I've proven to you that you don't have any sort of capacity, but also all your moral actions stem from the fact that you have some sort of control over these outcomes, I don't think side proposition can take this debate.
Thanks for that speech. We now call upon the second speaker for the proposition. Here.
Could I get 30 seconds?
Yes, you may. Second prop.
Yeah, just set in for timer. Okay, am I audible? Because my net has been really bad.
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. Starting.
POI preference.
POI
please.
preference.
Oh yeah, POI preference is if they could unmute themselves. Starting in 3, 2, and 1. Is it enough to simply bring a child into existence? Or do you have a moral duty to ensure that that life will be good, will be safe, and fulfilling? The point at which they haven't proved to you any morality and simply blamed it all on external circumstances, I don't think that they can win this debate. Because I think that it is these parents that make that conscious choice or conscious choice of even having a kid in the first place. To create life without the reasonable certainty of providing a good future isn't simply just irresponsible, it's an imposition of hardship on a vulnerable being who never consented to this gamble. Today, as proposition, we argue that to bring a child into the world without the ability to provide for them is not only careless, it is fundamentally immoral. Very, very proud to propose. But a few pieces of rebuttal before then. Number one, the idea that your uncertainty is life is literally inevitable, so it shouldn't even matter in the first place. Sure, I agree to this. While life sure has inherent uncertainties, etc., this doesn't excuse neglecting basic responsibilities that you have before a child is born. We're not arguing for total certainty, but for a reasonable assurance of meeting the child's essential needs, like being able to be financially secure in order to provide for them in the very, very first place. Just because these outcomes can't be fully guaranteed doesn't just justify taking unnecessary risks with another person's well-being in the very, very first place. I think bringing a child into foreseeable deprivation or hardship is simply morally irresponsible. Oh, how do you have control over disabilities and health issues, etc.? I think they completely ignore our point here, because we discussed ideas about how there's genetic history or how there's a long line of severe illnesses in families, etc. You have cousin marriages, etc., in which parents not taking proper blood tests to identify leukemia or any other all of those transferable diseases. On our side, we simply think that parents will be more careful about like going to doctors and identifying the likelihood of whether you will be able to transmit those changing diseases into their children in the first place. They don't realize that all these problems that they're making, and that so many of these patterns are easily, very, very easily identifiable. Making this weird claim about like the stock market crash doesn't excuse you from the fact that you were hyper poor all your life with no job just to bear a child selfishly. I think that is what uncertainty is. That is what it looks like within this debate. You have to stop making irrelevant claims here. This idea about reproductive autonomy and how right to bear, like you have a right to bear a child because it is your body, I think that simply means that women can then kill their fetuses off too. I don't think that is the problem here. The problem is not, hey, I have the moral right to choose whether or not to bear a child in my body. The moral argument is simply this, that the child should exist in this world much after you bear them, because the child exists in this world much after you bear them in your body. They should not be exposed to terrible circumstances, something that they never consented to. But also this idea then that like about like your entire reproductive autonomy, I think that while reproductive freedom is sure really important, it isn't an unrestricted right. It comes with responsibilities because you are literally birthing another human. Just as society recognizes the importance of these parental duties once a child is born, we must recognize those moral duties before birth as well. I think the freedom to have children must be balanced with that responsibility to ensure that the life that you're providing will simply be positive and sustainable, at least from the parents' end. An unrestricted view of like reproductive autonomy simply ignores any of that long-term welfare of the child. This can create all of that preventable suffering. I think on our side, we simply tell you that this true responsibility respects not only the right to create life, but also the duty to provide for that life. Their weird characterization about capitalism and whatnot, I think that sure, even if all of those problems exist, but I still think that it is parents that are the ones that make conscious choices about their children in the first place. Oh, whether or not I'm going to send my child to be a doctor, etc. These are all conscious choices that parents make because they have a control over the child's life. I think at that point in time, since parental role is so important in things that you do, in things like education, etc., then it's really important that you recognize that you as a parent are able to simply provide for your children. You aren't poor, that you aren't able to sustain all of those like other basic necessities for these children. What did we give you? No engagement on their end. the principle of moral responsibility and simply non-harm. I think that our duty not to harm another is simply amplified when that harm is both foreseeable and it is when it is preventable. I think when parents bring a child into the world, they do so with full knowledge that this child has no control over its conditions of its life. Since parents unilaterally impose existence on the child, I think that they take on an asymmetric moral responsibility for the child's potential suffering as well. If parents cannot be reasonably certain of avoiding preventable suffering, then creating life becomes an act that simply disregards this very important principle. I think like this entire principle is not just about preventing immediate physical harm, but it also means shielding a person from conditions that will hinder their development, their fulfillment, and freedom. I think that you have an obligation to avoid creating harm when it is foreseeable and when we control the factors that lead to it. But also thirdly, I think the child by nature of not existing yet has literally no way to consent to the risk and the benefits of this life, and they concede to this. But I think what this does essentially is that this creates a moral paradox on their end. If the parents cannot control for harm, they're effectively choosing to impose a life of unknown or suboptimal quality without any kind of consent. Since the child cannot opt out once they're born, it's essential that these parents be able to guarantee a somewhat life worth living, even if it is from their end. We gave you this idea about how parents are generally really short-termist in nature. We gave you ideas like how these parents think that, oh, maybe this child can heal me, I couldn't become a doctor and I'll have a son, etc., or that my parents are telling me that I'm getting older, so I should have kids, right? So if it's fine if I'm extremely poor, I can just leave that on for later. These are fundamentally short-term thought processes that do not pan out favorably for the children in the first place. You see children that are raised amid parental conflict, right? This results in literally emotional and even physical abuse on their end. You see children to environments where resources for them are really inadequate, which leads to issues like malnutrition or even starvation. In extreme cases, these children are born into war zones or other unsafe regions, like the ongoing conflict in Israel, Palestine, etc. It was their fundamental burden to prove to you why, as a parent, it is not immoral for you to put out, for you to give birth to a child simply because all of these circumstances exist around you, where their lives are at a constant risk. When parents don't consider their ability to meet a child's needs, I think the children frequently simply just suffer lowest self-esteem or emotional damage from toxic parenting or even coercive expectations. We told you that you as a parent need to be ready to provide for even good life for even all of these disabled kids. No like engagement on their end. They can't do that at second. But ultimately, I think that requiring thoughtful consideration before having children just ensures a foundational commitment to the child's future well-being. You foster environments in which there's generally really safer, in which they're healthier and we're free from the weight of their parents, etc. If your individual circumstances can even be healthy financially or even emotionally, right? This is where the entire gap idea simply doesn't come, because I think that even when you're talking about a healthy environment, it simply needs to be a good, healthy, emotional environment in terms of freedom, in terms of agency, and in terms of avoiding as much pain and suffering for these kids as possible. What is the impact of this? Why do we win? Because there's just generally a ton of healthier families on our side, because you have more considerate parents that are more financially stable. But I'll give you another tangent to this, but before that, I will take a peek. 3.
You say that this is an imposition of existence and that is why it is unjust. But for any practical potential harms or benefits to actually materialize, you would need that existence in the first place.
Sure, I concede to that, but I literally don't think that that is what this debate is about. This debate is literally about whether or not the child should even come into birth within the first place, because it is the parents' responsibility, because they're the ones that they're the ones that give birth to their parents in the first place. Another tangent to this: parents are simply worse off on their end, because now they have to work harder, they have to make more money to get their children to school, they have less personal space, and all of this means that in those moments where love is not enough, you start resenting your own life, your actions, your consequences. But notice that most of the times it's simply the ideology that parents say that they overwhelmingly believe that a child will solve all of their problems, which is why they want that child in the first place. You're at a point of no return. You've literally hammered yourself in the foot. What do we tell you then? What happens on opposition? Opposition lives in this screwed world where potential of benefit simply drives all of their decisions, despite actual more obvious indicators during the time of birth that harm will come to the child. This is true because gauging and figuring out the potential harm to the child is much easier compared to figuring out all of those abstract potential that this child has to change your circumstances. This is really important, because all the harm that exists in your life currently will be translated to your child, and because it is a real material existing harm, people can very be easily identify just most of it if they can predict it, right? And at a point in time where your literal conditions exist tangibly within your life, because they have no engagement to our principle whatsoever, because simply reproductive autonomy only matters if you're able to provide good conditions. Opposition. Great proposition.
Thanks for that speech. And I'll call upon the second speaker for the opposition. Here.
Yeah, can I just get like 10 seconds? I have to set up my timer.
That's fine.
Okay. Am I both audible and visible?
Yep. POI
Yeah.
preference before we start, please.
I'll take POIs in the chat. All right. Are we starting my speech in 3, 2, 1? I think there's a huge strategic mishap that happens at side proposition within this debate. That is to say that at first, and this is something that they did not clarify at second prop, I think third prop is a bit late to clarify this, that certainty in their definition of the world, in their definition of this belief, should only be limited to before birth. That literally blows out all of their impacts. Because how do they try to rebut our point about how you cannot have certainty pre-birth, etc.? All their responses are that problems might emerge post-birth, right? If those are the only rebuttals that they can provide, I think that their policy actually, or their belief for how they are shaping it within this debate, doesn't actually deal with the harms that they talk about. But also, I think they shirk their burden within this debate. How is that? Because they're saying that, oh, you only need to talk about reasonable circumstances, etc., and that is something that they try to do because they realize that you cannot dictate the circumstance of your life, and that is why they actually try to squirrel the debate. But also, I would like to add here, I think that providing has a very, very particular definition when you're talking about a good life. It has a very reductionist definition. That is to say that being able to provide is historically linked to the fact that you need to have wealth or you need to have the material means to actually provide for your children. That is what this debate is about, and that is what they have been arguing since the start of this debate. I think that is a truth that is alienating, but I'll talk about that within my issues, right? I think happiness cannot be guaranteed just by wealth, and that is the definition that they have been pushing since the start of this debate. I think there are alternative means of happiness, even if you cannot provide a good life per se on their side of the house. But also, their case revolves to one thing within this debate. I'll deal with that in my first issue. They say that the reason why this is immoral is because there might be potential pragmatic harms to the child. I just want to talk about this for a second. To prove that, number one, this is something that makes this action immoral, you have to attach this consequence, etc., in a meaningful way to the actor. Insofar as we have proven in this debate, there are things that are literally outside of your control, something that will be further substantiated within my speech, and the fact that you actually cannot control this in any meaningful way. I think at that point, you cannot say that it's immoral. But also, they can only claim that this is immoral if it translates into consequence in terms of decreasing the child's utility. Insofar as I prove to you that there are alternative means of eliciting happiness within life, I think we win this debate very clearly. But we think that provision does not equal a good life, or provision is not in your control. What does it look like? Because this is, number one, rooted in capitalism and materialism, right? Most poor people are not this greedy. Most poor people don't care that much about living in an elitist neighborhood or living in a mansion, etc., right? But also, the fact that they claim that there is a sham social mobility or that you had control over the economic means of your life. No, we posit, and we have posited this since first, that the race is something that is rigged. That looks like historical materialism, which created the bourgeoisie and the elite class through inheritance. That looks like how colonialism and imperialism literally created the global south. That looks like how mechanistically capitalism functions in a way where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, because it's premised on actually targeting markets and making sure that you get the most wealth out of the masses, etc. And if that is the characterization of the world, if that is what it's happened for centuries, I do not think that they can claim that life is fair or that these people had a control over their circumstances. I think at that point in time, if someone is part of the lower class, they were probably born into this, right? Or maybe they were part of the poverty cycle, etc., or capitalism did not give them a way to escape. If there's no agency or autonomy within this particular context that still stands within this debate, I don't think they can prove immorality, because you cannot be held responsible for the fact that these things might happen, etc. The second thing they talk about is, oh, you need to be a good parent. Your parent might want you to be a doctor. You might not want to be a doctor. I think that those things are probably motivated by caregiving incentives anyways, right? The fact that there's an attempt to create certainty in your life, which, by the way, is your endpoint. So even if you are being told that maybe being a doctor is something that's good for you, that's literally what you're positing on your side. But they say that parents are very irresponsible. I'm going to flip this argument, and this also acts as positive contribution, that I think parents actually become more responsible at the point in time that they consider having a child or have a child in the first place, right? I think that the fact that you had a child changes your conception about life. This literally looks like how most parents, etc., start having very, very altruistic incentives. They start being very, very sacrificial in the way that they are actually approaching the world. This looks like how most people people, when they have a child, start saving banks, etc., so the child can go to college. There is such a common truth within the world. I think this is categorically untrue at that point in time, right? But also, they say their entire context and all their argumentation stems from the fact that the world is bad. Their entire context of capitalism is something that's concessionary, because that potential parent was a victim of the system. They do not have autonomy within that system that they claim. Then the second issue in this debate, how it cannot be immoral. So then, what is their push within this debate? They say that you have informed choice, etc., in terms of the consequences that this child might have, and that you have some autonomy. I clash this, number one, with the uncertainty that you have in terms of like maybe how the economy is going to function, whether you're going to have a job, etc., 2 weeks from now. But also, if they're talking about very temporary certainty, again, that does not deal with any of the harms that they're trying to paint out. So at that point in time, they don't even have a case. But also, I just want to say, I don't think you have choice. For example, our entire argument on naturalism comes up here, which will literally explain to you how there is natural biological imperatives that make you want to procreate, that make you want to have a continuation of life within children. That means it is not a choice. Neither do you have information, neither are you completely autonomous. And that's the first idea that I'm going to use as rebuttal. But also secondarily, I think that there are tenets of immorality that are very, very important for you to say something is immoral. I think intent really matters. You as a parent have no intent to actually create harm or impart harm on this child, right? You're probably going to love them a lot. But secondarily, you don't have the information, right? Because there is not certainty. But thirdly, and most importantly, you don't have autonomy over the consequence. I don't think that you can ever be certain about whether you're going to give a good life to a child. And I don't think that was actually something that you could have actually meaningfully made sure happened in your life, because the fact that the world was rigged against you, because the world was such a cruel place. Again, if that cannot be tied to you, it cannot be part of you being a meaningful moral actor, because that is something that was fundamentally out of your control. That should not be the cause of passing a value judgment on your actions. What does this look like? You can analogize this how within insanity, please, etc., because the fact that there's circumstance, that there's autonomy, etc., you are let go. That is to say, when they talk about things like, oh, people who have genetic diseases should not be allowed to procreate, I think that's a horrible thing to say, and I think that it's fundamentally tackled by this associated belief that we use within the common world today, right? But they said that, oh, you're going to be aware of these impacts. I don't think that you're aware of those impacts. I already rebutted this. But also, this idea is fundamentally premised on consequence, and a child is unhappy or there's a lack of utility. This is unlikely for three reasons. Number one, the love and affection. All of the analysis that Shiraz gave you on mothers, etc., how they use this as liberation, how they really care about their child and probably overtly care about their child and providing with the most love and affection at the point in time that they are economically underprivileged, because it's a point of liberation for them, and they're going to probably do that. Number two, the socialization of these children. They probably care more about identity or the struggle of their parents, and they're going to see it in a meaningful way, not just that, oh, why don't we live in a mansion mom or something like that. But also, this is all that you have ever known in your life. So you're not going to feel as bad about, maybe not having McDonald's every week, because you're not someone who lived in DHA all of your life, right? But thirdly, alternative definitions of happiness and a good life that exists. This looks like definitions of happiness that are not infected by the word providing, which is inherently materialistic. This looks like how emotions or small moments of happiness or the loving conversations you have with your mother is something that's going to be good for you. But then within this, they said there's an imposition of existence. All of their potential benefits, by the way, stem from this imposition of existence. That is to say, on their side, I would like to say that rights actually stem from life. So any potential incapacitation of rights, which is marginal at best, because they have not proven that to a great degree, is going to lead to you, like, it cannot be weighed higher than your right to life, because all rights stem from that. But also, I think the non-identity problem analysis comes in here, how you're ridding someone of their existence. That's a much greater moral harm than any moral harm that's going to happen on our side of the house. But also, lastly, deeming this immoral makes you immoral. You inhibit the right to bodily autonomy and reproduction of women, and I want to weigh that against the rights of a potential future child versus your current inherent right to bodily autonomy. Number two, human biology, naturalism, etc., how you incapacitate a fulfilled human life by this policy. But also, this is immoral because it's literally rooted in eugenics and natural selection. They say things like, you want richer, healthier kids within the world. I think it's the worst thing that you can say, and they have to be restricted on their side of the house. Why? Because if they believe this is immoral, they don't want people to do this. I think that's also restrictive in terms of women's reproductive rights and their own liberation. It leads to things like artificial selection, like the classist narratives that we espouse, they apply within their case. Because the fact that we're not blaming people for fundamentally things that are outside their control, it does not make you an immoral actor, because you cannot be blamed for that. You were not party to it. And because we rebutted everything that they said, clearly side JT opposition.
Thank you for that speech. Just a kind reminder to the speakers on the floor to not exceed the 8-minute marker, or rather, if you have to, not the 8-minute and 15-second marker. After the 15 seconds, 8 minutes and 15 seconds, the judges are obliged to not write anything down. Having said that, I now call upon the third speaker for the proposition. Kindly let us also know your PY preference before you begin. Here.
Also, just wait one moment. One judge has to grab their charger, they've said. So whenever you're back, Munir.
Is the judge back?
Munir, are you here?
No, I don't think Munir is back yet.
Okay, Munir is back. We can resume.
All right,
Okay,
then
just a
second prop. I mean, sorry, third prop.
Yeah. And POI preference too, please.
Am I going to start? My POI preference is if you could unmute yourself, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. What side opposition needs to understand is that this is not a policy debate, right? You are talking on the and not debating on the basis of morality and whether it is more and whether if it is moral for a parent to bring a child into the circumstances that you are aware of and that you know will be bad or unsustainable for the child to grow up in within the very first place, right? What side opposition seems to think is that, oh my God, love and affection can simply make up for the homelessness I feel, for the paralysis that I might have due to some sort of genetic disease that exists. This is a highly immoral assumption that they make on their side of the case, right? Which is ironic since morality is the aspect which you are debating on within the very first place, right? What do side opposition say then? They say that, oh my God, since you in a lower class are born into a capitalist economy, it is completely fine if you bring another child into the capitalist economy. We say that this is simply not true. This is simply an unrealistic. This is simply an unrealistic factor that does not help their case within any manner, right? Because understand what their case simply is. They say that even if you are born in lower class circumstances, you can bring another child into the lower class circumstances, and they will survive there simply because they are not used to having because they are not used to having
luxuries, right? I say that when we talk to you about the uncertainty and sustainable circumstances for the child, we are not talking about luxury within the very first place. We are talking about basic rights and necessities for that child. This looks like having food on the table 2 or 3 times a day. This looks like having education. This looks like having the ability or the autonomy to engage in these sort of things within the very first place, right? A choice that is not available on your side of the case when you are simply bringing the child for the sake of giving birth, right? What do they say then on the principle? Their principle is that, oh my God, you have bodily autonomy that exists, so now you can bring a child into unforeseen, horrible, awful circumstances, right? We say this is simply not true. At the point in time where you are talking about autonomy, we don't care if you, for example, abort the child due to the circumstances. But what we are arguing on, what our principle was, is that you have a responsibility towards this child that exists within the very first place. And let me show you why it outweighs their principle, right? Because understand that this is not a child, because this is a child that is going to be impacted far later on within its life, right? It is going to have a life of its own. It is not going to be simply impacted by your bodily autonomy. Your bodily autonomy is going to your bodily autonomy might seem significant for a small amount of time, but at the point in time where this child starts to grow up, where you as a parent have to put in extra time and effort to put food on the table every day, where you as a parent are not fulfilling your responsibility towards the child within the very first place. At that point in time, we believe that bodily autonomy is not as important as your obligation towards that child. That is why you are going to be deemed as an immoral actor if you do not fulfill your responsibilities within the very first place, right? Moving on to my first issue within this debate on where morality is better off in general. They say that, oh my God, morality is not morality. Morality should not be debated on, and you are not immoral for bringing the child into awful circumstances because you have no control over them. I say that this is simply not true, right? You do have some control over the circumstances that you are bringing the child in within the very first place. Why is that true? At the point in time where I am a poor farmer who is working 24/7 just to put food on the table for me and my wife, that is the point in time where I believe that I should not bring a child into this life because my financial circumstances don't allow it within their nature, right? At this point in time where you cannot simply say that, oh my God, since the child is not used to having two plates of food on the table every day, so the child will be simply fine with being starved and with not having education within the very first place. This is simply a weak rebuttal. It is not moral at all within its nature, right? But secondly, on the idea that society has always based morality on an informed speculation within the very first place, right? This looks like how you don't send volunteers to war within the very first place simply on the speculation that there might be some harm inflicted on them within the very first place, right? I think at the point in time where you as an individual have the choice or have the autonomy to make that informed decision on the circumstances that you are bringing the child into because of situations that are within your control within the very first place, that is the point in time where you should definitely consider the circumstances of your life and what the child's life will be in general within the very first place, right? Then thirdly, on the issue of diseases and how you should be allowed to bring a child if you have the sort of genetic diseases, right? I say this is simply not true. You say that our case is about the fact that you should not bring a child into this world within in the very first place if you have those genetic diseases that could be passed on towards to it. I say that is true, right? And that is a moral decision by on three metrics, right? Firstly, the idea that this child is going to suffer from these genetical diseases, and that is something that is not their fault. That is something the parents' fault. That is something that the parents knew about. That is something that the parents could have stopped by not giving birth to that child. Because understand that those biological imperatives that you talk about, that you do not mechanize to me, are not as important as the life that the child is going to live if for the next years, right? The child a life that you as an individual are going to have to sustain, a life that is going to be always overburdened by the fact that you have those sort of genetical diseases existing, right? I think at the point in time where there is a prospect or there is a possibility that you might pass on leukemia to your child or blood cancer to your child within the very first place, that is the point in time where it is immoral for you to have that child within the very first place, right? Before moving on to my second clash, I'll take a viewer. 5, 4.
Moral actions require you to have some sort of meaningful moral autonomy. If you did not have any autonomy of whether you inherited genetic disease, why should you be held morally responsible or immoral for that?
understand that the principle that we brought to you is that you have a responsibility towards your child. I think at the point in time where you know that you have this disease that exists within you, at the point in time where you actually care about the child you are bringing into this world, at the point in time where you care about the fact that this child is going to suffer inherently because of the genetical disease that exists and that might be passed on to the child within the very, very first place, I believe that it is your moral obligation to make sure that the child that you are bringing into this world will not inherit that disease. I think it is your moral obligation to make sure you don't have a child within that very, very first place, because that child's life is going to be filled with inherent suffering and not much more than that, right? Because understand that at the point in time where you do birth a child like this, you have to take care of special circumstances. At the point in time where you're not able to sustain that child in those special circumstances, and the point in time where you're not able to cater to the specific medical needs that the child might have, at the point in time where you are not able to classify the inherent suffering that it will face, at the point in time where you are not able to rectify that, then that is the point. Then that is the point in time where you should not be having a child within the very first place. We think that just because your parents decided to inflict that suffering upon you, you should not turn it into a vicious cycle of having children that will continue to perpetuate that suffering within the very, very first place, right? But last issue then on how poor people don't exist about living in the elitist economy, and how provision is not in your control, and how the circumstances will get better eventually depending on the stock market, etc., right? We believe that this is a very flimsy case to make, right? Because I think at the point in time where you are aware of your surroundings as an individual, at the point in time where you are aware that you are bringing a child in specific circumstances, at the point in time where you can make a speculation based on your surroundings and circumstances, etc., that is the point in time where you as an individual hold an inherent responsibility towards your child, right? Right, at the point in time where we prove to you where the principle is better on our side, at the point in time where we prove to you are better able to fulfill your responsibility towards the child, at the point in time where we prove to you how the child is likely to be better in general and have a better life, give this debate to side probably.
Thank you for that speech. I now call upon opposition web. Here.
Can I get 30 seconds?
Sure.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
I will be starting my speech in 3.
Sorry, did you give your POI preference?
Oh, sorry. I'll take them in the chat. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side proposition posits, or they bring this idea that they want to have a sort of like pure Aryan race on their side of the world. What then happens this, or the problem with that is that we tell you from first is that leads to the eradication of certain communities. That is a world that we do not want to support. A couple of strategic observations before that. Firstly, at first they're like, guys, like impacts post birth can be quantified, etc., and they're simply not a part of this debate. But like 90% of their refutation, a big chunk of their case is literally, impacts post birth, etc., or impacts that can be quantified. So at that point in time, a big chunk of their case is simply like not applicable within this debate. But secondly, a concession at third prop, because at third prop they concede that these people only require like basic rights, etc. That concedes to our idea of as to how there's a subjectivity when it comes to living a good life, or what the meaning of a good life is. That is that for example, a farmer who has never been to school, etc. For example, for him providing a good life, or might just be, for example, getting his school to school, etc., or getting him admitted into the school, etc. That is an extreme concession within that. But then lastly, and I want to like push this, they have simply not engaged with our argumentation. Why is that so? Because the only thing that they've engaged with in our moral argument is, the right of reproduction, etc. When Shiraz gave you like 6 structural reasons within that moral idea of as to how the plight of women, etc., and as to how you're basically, giving women liberation, etc. The idea on as to how there's underprivileged communities, and you're basically going to the narrative that the monarchs, etc., perpetuated in the very first place, never engaged with. But what are the 3 key issues within this debate? Firstly, on the right to life versus all of the moral impacts that we quantify to you. They say, firstly, that you have the right to life, etc. We say that the alternative is no life, so this is non-comparative, etc. But then secondly, why don't homeless people kill themselves? The simple fact that the alternative is no life. They feel that there's some sort of hope, or the probability that, no life is so much more worse than the current condition they're living in. So this necessarily proves that the alternative is far worse. But then thirdly, they respond to us how, you have the response, you have a moral responsibility of the child, etc. Here's the thing, right? Negligence can only apply insofar as you had the autonomy to not be negligent in the very first place to begin with. Insofar as that's true, the probability of them like pushing this burden of moral responsibility simply does not apply. But then lastly, deeming this moral makes you immoral in the very first place to begin with. That's what we have been, arguing for since first. And like lastly, this leads to the eradication of most like communities, etc., that are screwed up by the capitalist structures, or the structures that disproportionately harm these communities in the very first place to begin with. So there's actively like lesser lives than on their side of the house. But then secondly, they say that, you're knowingly going to hurt them, etc. I have a very simple response. I ask a very simple question. If, let's say, a person left his or lost, who was doing financially well, lost his job, etc., within COVID, and now he simply does not have the capacity to, let's say, give their lives the same quality of life that he initially did so, is his child now immoral, etc.? I am unsure, because life, or like your generally like your capital or financial status, etc., like is contingent upon a host of arbitrary reasons that are simply not in your power, etc. For example, if your country's like stock market crashes, or if there's a global recession, etc., all of these can be quantified within the white, like black and white binary that they want you to believe it to be. But what do we then tell you on a comparative? We tell you a couple of things. We tell you about the right to reproduce, etc. The only response that I then get from this is that, people are dying, etc. Like, I'm unsure as to why that's true. But then secondly, what do we tell you independent of that? The idea on how this is the first time, or this is the only mechanism through which women got away, in which they could be liberated from the society that has historically tied them. The idea is about on how there's resource asymmetry, and historically on how there's hereditary reasons due to which people have been marginalized historically. Our analysis is about how the race is rigged for these very people, that's how you're like basically giving into this idea of monarchies. Simply weigh that up. We tell you that this is the first time through women got the access to, let's say, you to have the like right to bodily autonomy, versus the idea of like right to life, etc., which is non-existent. I think simply by virtue of the fact that we give this women liberation, simply because we make the race less rigged for these people, we think that we win this clash. But then secondly, this idea, about secondly, which is the like practical idea about them, we had a couple of responses. We posited a couple of things. So Tahan told you at second, and I saw parents are likely to be more responsible because they actively recognize that there's an active addition to their family, or the simple fact that there's a new member within their family, so they're probably likely to actively plan things for their children. Like in contrast, what do they tell you? They tell you that there's things like toxic parenting, etc. I think that this can only be immoral insofar as the child actively recognizes this or actively blames their parents for this. We think that in a vast majority of instances, children make this a part of their identity, etc. Because things like solace, etc., is extremely subjective. We think that the probability of them making this a part of their identity is like increasingly important, because at that point in time, you're resisting against these like oppressive structures that have disproportionately affected you. But then secondly, we think their idea about Anash, how you're going to have a ton of healthier families, ton of healthier, richer families. We think that's on a comparative versus our idea of we told you Anash, how you're doing natural selection on the basis of resource, etc. That's extremely bad. But then lastly, they say your parents don't work hard, etc. I have a couple of responses. Your mother quite literally goes into labor, etc. Literally, like, I don't know, her organs are literally like misarranged, etc. We think that at that point in time, the simple fact that you have more expectations attached to these very people, the simple fact that your parents are more likely to actively going into like taking more jobs, etc. For example, if your father, I don't know, might take 3 jobs, etc., because you're actively a part of that family, etc. All of this is extremely true, and I'm unsure as to why all of the things about like toxic parenting, etc., risks, etc., would essentially exist, because that is again only applicable to a very small majority of stakeholders within this idea. But what do we tell you? But then lastly, this idea about certainty versus uncertainty, we tell you that this is contingent upon a host of arbitrary things, etc. We tell you as to how people with disabilities, etc. For example, people on their side of the house, people that have, let's say, cystic fibrosis or like sickle cell anemia, should not have the right to reproduce then on their side of the world. We think that that's extremely harmful at the point at which these people did not have the autonomy or did not have the option to be born in that very instance, hence they can be held morally culpable. But then secondly, we tell you that outcomes of life, etc., aren't determined by you, but these oppressive structures that have done this in the very first place. But then thirdly, we tell you that this is extremely subjective, because for a vast majority of people, getting, let's say, I don't know, a luxury car, etc., is not important. For them, having the most basic necessities, etc., is extremely important. We've characterized you that since first versus their idea on as to how already existing people do exist, etc. I have a couple of responses to this, because here's the thing, right? On their side of the house, certainty still doesn't exist because of all the things that we've told you within this debate. But secondly, we tell you that there's a certain degree of optimism attached to it, because insofar as you recognize that you're bringing the amount of like therapeutic value that it generally holds, or simply by virtue of the fact that you're bringing a new person into the family, is extremely important. Insofar as that gives you more certainty about with what you're going to do in life, etc. They tell you, about things. What they tell you then is, on as to how you're doing it only because you have things like common understandings, divorce, etc. We say that that's not true because of a couple of reasons Sultan told you, etc. Never engage with. Lastly, we think that people in the global north, etc., still do not have certainty, etc. For example, people living in Florida were literally screwed by Hurricane Milton, etc. If the country with the I don't know, the most capital, etc., is like uncertain on as to even if they like can provide a good quality of life due to things like climate change, etc. I am unsure as to how the global south can. Insofar as that's true, insofar as they've only like rebutted only like 1/6 of our argumentation, give this debate.
Thanks for that speech. This concludes the substantive speeches for this round. I now call upon opposition reply. Here.
Am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Side proposition has a really interesting and amusing case in this debate. That is to say that their case shifts at, I think, 3 times within this debate in 3 different speeches. That looks like how I agree that this might not be a policy debate, but their literal first 2 speakers said that this is something that they want to enact. That is to say that they want richer, healthier kids to be born, and this is a restriction that they will be willing to impose because they feel that the harms outweigh the benefits. That looks like how they literally said these things. And if they want this policy to make any sense, this belief to make any sense, that you would also say that you don't want these people to procreate in the first place. If that is true, then yes, our arguments about systemic disenfranchisement that you can do towards certain communities, certain ethnic minorities, etc., and literally incapacitate them from continuing themselves generationally, that also applies. But secondarily, I just want to talk about how they make this debate something that it is not. This debate is about being able to having certainty in providing a good life. I'm pretty sure the motions committee very carefully phrased this motion, and that is the motion that we have been debating. So them talking about not having any food on the table, talking about homeless, etc., literally isn't what this debate is about. Because again, that is not a good life. That is a reasonable standard. If the only thing that they're trying to win this debate on is a reasonable standard, I think that exists in like most cases where children are born, etc. We're talking about a good life. That is a high bar to meet. That is a bar that most people cannot meet, because there's an alienating truth for people living under the poverty line, for minority communities, etc., who have been forced to live in a system that is rigged against them. What were the two issues in this debate? I'm going to make these two issues very simple for you. The harm to the child is the only thing that they posited, and we told you how this is completely immoral and how you cannot be held morally responsible for those harms, etc. And we mitigated those harms for you. But I just want to talk about their only actual rebuttal or response to all of our analysis about moral responsibility. They said one thing, that you have a moral responsibility to the child. This moral responsibility is complicated by a lot of other things. You cannot just assert this in a one-liner and expect it to be debate winning. That looks like how this moral responsibility is tied to provision or creating a good life. Two things that are very, very important. Vision is inherently like tied to the material world, something that you literally have no control over, how you are locked out by capitalism, etc., how you cannot be held morally responsible or be called a more immoral actor because of that. But secondarily, the fact that you have to be certain about providing a good life means something that you cannot actually achieve within life, because again, changing economic implications, etc. The fact that it's very, very hard to be certain that you're going to provide a good life, we don't even know how high the bar they set within this debate, right? Because again, not having food on the table is something that does not apply within this case. But then I think that all of this is hinged on harm. The moral responsibility for the child is only exists insofar as they're proving some sort of harm, right? I think that again, we told you in second and in third and at first that no life is still worse than the little life that you have. Why is that? Because alternative means of happiness, etc., exist. Because the fact that you can still have emotions, etc., or you have small moments of happiness, they're still going to feel good. This looks like, even if we're talking about homelessness within this debate, homeless people do not kill themselves. Why? Because of the fact that they weigh up every single day within their life that there is something meaningful within the world right now that I should live for. Because they are able to make that meaningful, they realize that life is something that we should not rid ourselves of. We should not rid ourselves of our existence, but also life weighs higher than all of these other harms that they pose, because all other rights stem from life. That is what we told you. But their harms to the child literally look like genetic diseases or the lack of wealth. I think if the lack of wealth is tied to providing, that's not something you can be held morally responsible for, because it's a context you were also victim to. All of our analysis that was unengaged with on historical materialism, etc., colonialism, imperialism, the fact that you are locked out by the capitalist system. But if they're talking about literal genetics, again, we told you an associated belief that is still unrebutted about the insanity plea, for example. How if you are not in control of your actions in a particular circumstance, the fact that you could not choose whether you were born with that disability means that you cannot be held morally responsible for that. But insofar as your child would still live a meaningful, good life, because again, they won't have those extreme expectations of life, etc. That's something that is good. We didn't just tell you modally autonomy as a one. That was a one-liner in my speech. That was not something that was actually our entire moral case. We told you about women's reproductive rights, etc. Naturalism, right? How that influences the fact that you're making this choice, the fact that you don't have information, how you have tenets of morality like intent, like informed choice, etc. How you cannot be certain. Those are all things that still apply within this debate. I don't think people should be called morally bad actors for things that they have fundamentally no control over. You cannot have a moral bearing of an action if you did not intend that consequence or had no physical or more meaningful bearing on that. Because of all those reasons,
Thank you for that speech. I now call upon the reply speaker for the proposition to summarize the debate for their side and to end this debate as a whole. Here.
30 seconds.
Sure.
And one. The reason why opposition loses this debate is because they never prove to you why the right to have a child by default, moral given that the child would never even consents to it in the first place. I think at that point in time, all of those benefits or everything that they've said is all speculative on their side. This entire principle that they then give you, that people that have cystic fibrosis should not have the right to produce kids, etc. I have a few responses to this, and I think that this takes down their entire principle. Even if they're born with this, why should it be that the kid's fault to bear the disease just because their parents are born with it? The reason why it is more important to protect the child here from this disease is because you are now existing. You do not have the choice to go back and stop your parents from giving you this life-harming disease, but you can avoid punishing your child for the randomness that life gave you in the form of this disease in the first place. It does not matter in this debate if there was if it was not your fault that you did not choose to get this disease, because if we all agree to that principle, then I think that you should simply, then I should be allowed to let harm come to anyone around me just because things were done bad to me that I couldn't control, that life did you wrong so you can consciously do your child wrong. The point at which they don't draw comparative here and defend that, I don't think that they can win this debate. But a few things they sent then. Number one, that certainty cannot be determined pre-birth, and like that's why like our entire principle and debate falls. I think that number one, your life is simply going to be full of suffering on their end, because the point at which a child is born, when that person cannot even sustain that child fully in terms of emotional health, etc., I think the situation is only going to be worse off on your side. The idea that life is full of suffering through the stock market is going to crash on either side of the case. But I think the point in time in which you're talking about the conditions and whether this child is born or not, I think that those are things that are easily foreseeable. If you, with all your knowledge, regardless of you being a farmer or a politician, recognize that your kid's life will be bad according to the criteria that Natalia said at first that Shiraz chose to ignore, which was ignored in straw man, you still knowingly do it. And I think that then it is still immoral. This was the simple fame that we gave to you, and they turned this into really weird things. Like, oh, like hyper rich people then will only have kids on our side. If their case is then the Aryan race, etc. And I think that our simple response to this is that this case is not where every single poor person will choose to whether or not to have kids. If you have poor people that are helped by the state, so tax reform goes to them, their life is slowly getting better and better, then we think that this will inevitably recognize a situation where they can have kids and they can give them a reasonable life. And that's what this debate is. If they say a farmer will consider a good life to just be taking his kids to school, we think that that is fine, and we concede to this. And we've said this from the beginning, that your social narratives around you simply do not matter. If you think yourself and make the choice that if you make the choice that you can reasonably give your child a life without extreme harm, disease, or poverty and suffering to the best of your knowledge, then it is a moral choice that you have. All of these things may be out of your control, but I think that the choice to bring a child into the world isn't. Opposition had very one clear burden within this debate. They had to prove to you why this choice in and of itself isn't immoral, not to prove that the person themselves suffered a lot in colonialism, so it becomes moral for you to also make that child become an additional victim to the system. It does not matter if you have autonomy to change your life or not. I think even in our worst case possible, you do not. And you know and are sure, or are sure that you or a child cannot give you that autonomy to change those circumstances. So for example, if you're born into North Korea, I think it's really highly immoral choice to still bring this entire, like, your child into like this entire position of authoritarianism. The situation is even worse for their case, because their case now becomes that you're unable to generationally change your suffering, and the suffering is extreme and not small. You know your child won't change it either way, yet you still choose to like bring them in this, and you choose to harm them. Their entire idea about biological impulse, and this is really funny, and I already refuted this in my speech. We tell you that the child's right to life simply firstly just outweighs that biological impulse, because you have a fundamental power imbalance here where the parent is conscious to choose to fulfill their impulse in the very first place. But the child is not born yet to choose whether or want to suffer in a bad life, etc. So the parent needs to step in as the parent's guardian here and make that speculative moral choice for them. There's a bunch of things in which you have biological impulses for, but you don't act on them because they're all strong reasons that simply maybe do not exist. I think that's a really weird argument and a myth anyway. Lastly, then, on the right to women, I think that it's a really weird principle to then bring, because I think that they have to tell you why it is principally right to simply bring a child into those circumstances, the point at which you can't sustain themselves emotionally or physically or even financially, the point at which they don't do that and blame it all on external circumstances proposition.
What we're going to do then is move into the breakout rooms. I will open one. I think we should go, I suppose, into the prop one or the opposition one. I don't really mind.